Thanks for attending this beginner track session number 2 entitled Knowledge Modeling. Our presenter today is Josh Kullis. He's the Technical Services Manager and Knowledge Aware Consultant for Auros. And before I turn it over to Josh, I want to remind everyone to keep chat open. Please feel free to enter any comments or questions you have during the session, and we'll have a few minutes at the end to go over those things. So without further ado, here's Josh.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, appreciate the introduction. Like Jim said, this particular presentation or this breakout session is going to be focused on knowledge modeling. We'll talk a little bit about what that means, but at a high level, what we really want to do is we want to start to increase fidelity in the evaluation of our information. So instead of asking people to, read through a document or read through a big piece of knowledge and then interpret it, then apply it to their program or to their activity or whatever it is that they're doing, what we want to do is we want to be able to model the knowledge. And there's a few different reasons that we want to do that. We want to increase the fidelity of the evaluation so that we're not reliant on areas that potentially we could encounter a human error. So when we talk about knowledge modeling, there's 3 main points that we want to go through. The first thing is precise. So we want our knowledge to be precise, and that goes back to people having to go through and read something, interpret what it means, then take that and apply it to their program or to their project. We want to be able to model the knowledge so it's extremely precise and we understand exactly what's being communicated from the author's perspective. And Auros has a rules engine that we'll get into that helps us do that, where information is put in and that rule is going to be processed and the outcome is returned. It's very clear what the outcome is. The other thing that we want to do is we want to standardize our knowledge capture. So we talked in the last presentation, if you were there, a lot about, there are different mechanisms that people can use to capture knowledge. Maybe an Excel file, we might have a PDF, you may have a Visio diagram. There are a lot of different things that you can use to capture knowledge. But with Auros, we want to standardize the way that the information is captured. And we'll go through the way that the value table kind of helps us do that. The knowledge packet does it in a lot of ways that we talked about in the last presentation, but we'll also go through how the value table kind of standardizes the way that information is captured. And then the third learning point for this particular presentation is we want that knowledge to be executable. And the big takeaway for this particular learning point is, as we're evaluating knowledge, there's only so much information that can be evaluated when humans are involved in the process. It takes time to open up a checklist, so to speak, and put information into it. But if we have these models and we start to model our knowledge, we can create ways that we can take machine processes and then we can start to execute those models without the necessity of human interaction. So where one example that we'll use when it comes to executable is, you may have a CAD model and you go in and you've got 50 or 100 different design best practices or design guidelines that need to be adhered to. Well, the traditional approach, you may have a designer or an engineer and they go through and they start evaluating those lines, right? There's 100 different items, they go through, they check them all automatically. Well, if we have those items modeled, we can take the information in Auros, we can interrogate the CAD model programmatically, and then check all of the items in a very quick sense. So instead of having to go through everything one by one, the system can check the information, it can execute that knowledge, and then we're not burdened or we're not restricted to the amount of information that can be done manually. So precise, we want to know exactly what the knowledge is. Standardized, we want it to be captured consistently. And then executable, we want to remove the restriction of manual evaluation or manual interaction with the information. So from that point, we're going to now come out of the PowerPoint. This was a little bit different from the previous session where we're going to take a look at a demonstration in Auros. So we saw some assessment controls in the previous demonstration. What we're going to go through here is information that's completely has no context. So everything that you see, with exception of the title in these knowledge packets, is just going to be Latin text. We do that on purpose because we're trying to communicate the concept, not necessarily the information that's in the knowledge packets. So the first step in modeling knowledge, or the first interaction model that we see generally when we go to customer sites, is the process of attestation. So we have people, they come in, they read the requirement, and they say whether or not they pass or fail it. So there are a lot of different failure modes that are potentially introduced in this particular situation, but I can say, this particular item, I'm adhering to it. My project, my program, my activity, whatever it is that I'm doing, I'm passing this particular requirement. But there are a lot of things, like I said, that potentially could cause that process to go awry, right? We may misinterpret the information the way that it was captured by the author. Maybe when the author captured it, it wasn't necessarily that accurate, but there were things that they're so familiar with that they take for granted that it doesn't necessarily get captured in the knowledge packet. So what we want to start to do is we want to start to create models of the knowledge. And when we do that, I'm going to open this knowledge packet up. Instead of just expecting people to read information that exists within a knowledge packet, and I apologize for the slowness, we want to start to create these models of knowledge down here. So in this particular case, we have a rule that is a minimum requirement, and we know that there are different conditions for this rule, where if this is your condition, the minimum is 5. If this is your condition, the minimum is 6. And any other condition, the minimum is 2. Instead of expecting people to come through and read what we have here in the knowledge packet or the information that's been captured, the rules engine, once we create this model, is going to allow us to then change the interaction model with the end user. So instead of having all the different text that exists, we're simply going to ask them to tell us what their condition is. So I'm going to pick one of these conditions. And then we're also going to ask for their measurement. So this particular measurement, I'm going to put in 4. And then based on the information that's put in, there's no interpretation of the rule anymore that has to happen manually from the end user. They put in the information that's necessary to process the rule, and then the system is going to process that rule automatically, right? We should have a minimum of 6. We said we have a minimum of 4. So you have a fail condition. If I come back and say that my value is 7 and evaluate, it's going to give me a green or a passed or a compliant condition. So we want to be able to take the information, we want to model the knowledge, and we want to put it into our assessment control. So the assessment control, like I've said before, it's a very flexible tool. You can start off with attestation, and then you can start to build these models into your process. So I'm going to change my view here. And I want to put that rule processing engine that we just talked about into my view. So now, where before I said that I'm green because I went through and I understood the information and I applied it, the new way of capturing information and applying it to a project is going to be through the model, right? So the same thing that we saw on the knowledge packet, that's going to be kind of a testing area so that you can see how the knowledge model reacts to different inputs. We're going to get that same view here when we're in the assessment control. So now I'm going to come over and I'm going to pick my condition. I'm going to put in my value. And when I evaluate, same way that the knowledge packet, when it was native and not in an assessment control, gave me the fail condition, I'm getting that fail condition here as well. But you'll notice that the compliance within this particular assessment and the context for how we're applying the information is also being tracked. So instead of the user having to understand the information, come out, apply it to their program, apply it to their project, and then evaluate and manually say what was happening, we're only going to ask them to give us their values. They'll pick their condition. They then put in the amount of information that's necessary to process the rule. And based on that processed rule, our conformance is going to be tracked automatically as opposed to the attestation that we saw a little bit earlier. So there's a lot of different ways that we can capture information and a lot of different ways that we can create these value tables. We did want to walk through just one example on how do we actually create these things. So we saw in the knowledge packet that I was just showing what a created value table looks like. But when I walk through the process of creating one here, a lot of times people will ask us questions about, how difficult is it to do this? Do you have users that frequently struggle? How hard is it to get it started at your organization? And it's pretty straightforward. We've done a lot of work over the past 3 or 4 years, going out, finding user groups, asking about the user experience. And we think that we've been able to put together something that's fairly straightforward. It's all point and click configuration, so you're not required to do any coding or anything like that. And essentially, when you create your knowledge packet, you can put a title in. So it's all point and click configuration. I'll double click. I'll just type demonstration in as my title. I hit apply and close, and the information is going to show up. I did forget. I'm going to zoom in a little bit just so that people can see a little bit better. So I double click in the white space to the right, an editor is going to open up. I put information into the editor, hit apply, and the knowledge packet is going to be captured there until I save it. But if we're talking about how do we create the actual model of knowledge, I'm going to go into the value table editor, and the first thing that we're going to see when this loads up is the parameter. So in this particular case, I'm just going to say that I have a minimum thickness for a part. I'm going to edit this parameter because the parameter is what we're evaluating. So when we start to create these models, they're going to be based around parameters. And then we can take those parameters and go into other systems, whether it's a CAD model, there may be different process tools that are looking at timing mechanisms, those kinds of things. And all of those things can be assigned parameters so that we can start to evaluate them in an executable fashion. So I'm going to just call this part thickness. Continue. Now we can see that parameter. But what I want to say is, what type of rule am I writing here? So this particular rule, we're going to say we have a minimum thickness. There's a lot of different ways that knowledge can be modeled. So if you have questions beyond what we go through here in this presentation, feel free to reach out to myself. We have a lot of different application engineers that are on the conference as well. You can message them directly through the chat mechanisms and through the networking tools. But there's a lot of different ways we can create rules. We're going to start with just a basic rule. It's going to be a minimum. So I'm going to select that. And when I select my type, that's telling the rule processor how it should behave. So we need to have a value that's above this in the particular case of a minimum. We need to have a value that's below if you were to select the maximum. But now I'm going to say that my part thickness needs to be a minimum of 4 millimeters. I'm going to double click in the white space there. In millimeters, it gives me some different suggestions. I'm going to go with length. And now in the edit window, we have the lightning bolt icon or the rule processing engine. So I'm going to click over to this, and it's going to allow me to process this rule and kind of give it a test to make sure that it's behaving the way that I expect it to behave. So if I'm an author, I can come in and say, if my part thickness was 3 millimeters and I evaluate, I apologize for the real estate here. I'm trying to zoom in so that everyone can see it on the small screen. But I put in my part thickness at 3, I evaluate, and it comes back as a fail condition. Same if I take 5, put it in, I evaluate, it gives me the pass condition. So I know that my rule has been constructed properly. I'm going to hit apply and close. Here we'll see the value table, and then I'm going to click save. It's going to ask me how I want to save my knowledge packet. For now, I'm just going to keep it work in progress. But essentially now I have a new knowledge packet. I've modeled my knowledge. And if I come back to the grid to open this up, we can see the demonstration knowledge packet that I just created. Here is my model of knowledge. And then my rule processing engine allows me to do the same thing that I was doing in the edit screen and put information in, and the model is now evaluating information as opposed to the user having to interpret everything that has been written in my knowledge packet. And then furthermore, once we get into the assessment control, similar to what we saw a few minutes ago, instead of people attesting whether they pass or fail, they put their information in through the rule processor. And like we talked about, if we get to the point, Jeff Mayhew mentioned that the knowledge-aware concept and the knowledge-aware process is a journey. Typically what we'll see, and this just kind of depends on the maturity of your organization, is we see manual attestation is generally where these implementations start. And as we start to see the value of the software, we start to see values of the concepts, we have the ability that maybe doesn't necessarily exist in a document to start putting these models into knowledge. We increase the fidelity of our evaluations, which allows us to then continuously learn, prevent recurring mistakes at a higher rate because these models are taking a lot of the different failure modes in evaluation and knowledge management out of the process. So if I come back to my presentation, I kind of just did this overview, but we want to make sure that instead of just capturing in text, we want to use the model of the knowledge so that we can make sure that the capturing is precise, standardized, that value table editor, whether you're in one community, is going to look the same, and the parameters and the rules engine function the same, whether you're in a community for workstation readiness, which is what we talked about in the earlier session, or potentially design review, or potentially the implementing of a process. The way that the information is captured and then visually displayed is going to be standardized. And then the big thing with knowledge packets, as we start to go on this journey and we try to get to the end of the journey, is being able to execute them without the restriction of how much information can be evaluated with human interaction. So I think at that point, Jim, are there any questions? I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Josh. Yes, so we have a few actually, and if anybody has any additional ones, please feel free to type them into the chat box. We had a really good one from Harsha at Autoliv. He's asking, is it possible to integrate these assessment packets directly into a CAD environment?
It is, yeah. So when we went through authoring the rule and we created the parameter of part thickness, Auros has the ability to communicate through APIs, through programming interfaces with different systems. So we can take the information in Auros, we can communicate that to the CAD model, and there's a few different ways we do it. Sometimes you can have measurements being made manually in the CAD model, associating them to the parameters, and then Auros will check the rules. As we get to further levels of maturity, the model itself can be parameterized. If the parameters in Auros match the parameters in the model, then there's no need for any manual interaction other than just saying, check this model. But then once the model check is initiated, any rules that exist in Auros will match up with the parameters the way that they exist in the CAD model, and the checks will be automatic. So it'll show you, let's say you have 50 different requirements. You're maybe adhering to 48 of them. The two that you're not adhering to are going to be flagged red or yellow or whatever condition we want to put in. That's configurable based on the needs of the group. That information is then going to be communicated to the designer, so they don't have to manually go through all 50 items. They can just focus on the 2 problem areas.
Very powerful stuff. Another great question from Jimmy. What are some reasons you would create a value table instead of a general knowledge packet without a value table?
So I think that's a very good question, because we've gone back and forth, I think, in the community about should we just use value tables all the time or should we not? And I think ultimately what it comes down to is just the maturity of the information. If you can create a model because you understand the knowledge enough, then we would recommend that you do that, because it's going to increase fidelity, it's going to increase understanding, all those kinds of things that we've talked about through the last couple presentations. Sometimes, though, we don't understand the information enough to be able to create the model, right? We might be kind of going through something for the first time, the second time we're doing R&D, we don't necessarily know what those rules are. So in that particular case, the knowledge packet is going to help us capture the application of the rule. It's going to help us capture all the data for what we did do. And then over time, as we start to learn, we get to this continuous improvement concept, and you start to be able to capture those rules. So I think ultimately, to answer the question, it just depends on the maturity of the information that you're capturing. If it's mature and you understand how to write the rule, then we would say use a value table. If it's not mature and you don't quite understand it yet, you can use the knowledge packet to help you understand it more, and at which point you could then create a value table or model after gaining additional understanding.
We had another one, Josh, from Sung Young. He's over in Korea, our friends at Hannon Systems. He's asking, does every single point need to be separated as a different K-pack, or can you merge them together as one K-pack?
That's another good question. It's a question we get a lot too. Like how do you determine what goes into one K-pack versus 10 K-packs? And like Jeff Mayhew talked about in his presentation earlier, if you start with the assessment and try to understand how people actually evaluate and what you're trying to get out of the knowledge that's being captured, that really helps us to understand, whether you should put everything in one knowledge packet or break it up into every single point gets its own knowledge packet. I would say in general, there's probably a happy medium that's maybe closer to the every point gets its own package, but we wouldn't necessarily create a knowledge packet for every single individual point. What we find when people create a knowledge packet that just has a ton of information is you can see some of the same confusion that comes from capturing something in a big Word document or a PDF. So we generally recommend breaking them up, but we don't necessarily recommend breaking them up into every single individual point, because from an end user perspective, the amount of effort that would go into evaluating some of those things, may just not be worth the time. So probably not a direct answer to the question, because there really is no direct answer. But I would say we generally would start breaking up, and you want to get closer to the side of, creating a knowledge packet for every piece of information. But at some point in time, it's probably a little overkill if you do that.
We did have one more. We got a couple minutes left. Josh, I apologize. This is not really specific to your presentation, but I think it's one that's worth reading because a few other folks on the call might have the same question. Stefan at BAE asked if new participants can register and join the conference after it started. Absolutely, they can. Stefan, I'm going to reach out to you directly. Your business development guy is Dan Flaherty, but if you aren't familiar with him, I'm going to get you in touch with him ASAP. If anyone else has additional colleagues or counterparts that you think might get some benefit out of this conference today or tomorrow morning, please feel free to reach out to any of us directly. Let us know. We'd be more than happy to get you signed up or give you information to get you signed up. With that said, I wanted to put a code into the chat link. If you've seen a few of these presentations already, if you wouldn't mind taking a couple of moments and filling out a quick Survey Monkey for us, we'd appreciate it. We definitely encourage your comments, both positive and negative. Feel free to be critical. We definitely use these comments every year to improve our conference year over year, and this is obviously the first one virtually. So other than some of the text being too small to read on the screen, we want to know what we can do better next year for you, and hopefully next year we'll be live in person. With that said, thank you, Josh, for another great presentation. Thank you all for coming on the line. Please, again, feel free to reach out to Josh or myself individually with additional questions. We can get you answers throughout the course of the day. And then again, please fill out the Survey Monkey. The next session will be coming up at 3:20, so about 7 minutes away. It's the third session in the beginner track. It's called the Seed Project. So we hope to see you all there, but we'll give you a couple minutes back for a little short break here, and we'll regroup at 3:20 for session 3. Thank you all.
Thanks.